Bikers kidnap a black boy for fun, unaware that his father is a battle-hardened soldier. Subscribe to the channel and tell us where you're watching from in the comments. The sun hung low over the dusty horizon, casting elongated shadows across the cracked asphalt of Ridgewood, a small southern town frozen in time. The air was thick with the scent of motor oil and scorched rubber, drifting from the auto shop at the edge of town where bikers often gathered. Ridgewood wasn't a place where strangers were welcomed, and the arrival of Marcus Wilson and his 12-year-old son, Jaden, had not gone unnoticed. Marcus stood on the porch of their weathered two-story house, scanning the empty street with sharp, calculating eyes. His broad shoulders tensed at every creak of wood under his boots, a habit forged from years of military service. Though Ridgewood was far from the battlefields he had known, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that danger was never too far away. Jaden sat cross-legged on the front steps, scribbling in a worn notebook. His pencil paused mid-sentence as a group of motorcycles roared past the house, their engines growling like predators. He didn't look up, but Marcus noticed the way his son's hand trembled ever so slightly before pressing harder into the page. "Jaden," Marcus called, his voice calm but firm. Jaden looked up, his dark eyes wide and alert. "Yeah, Dad?" Marcus nodded toward the house. "Time to head inside. Dinner's almost ready." Jaden hesitated, his gaze lingering on the road where the motorcycles had vanished. Marcus could see the questions forming behind his son's eyes. The same questions Marcus had asked himself when they first arrived in Ridgewood. But Marcus knew the answers wouldn't bring comfort. As the boy gathered his things, Marcus's thoughts drifted back to their arrival 3 weeks ago. He had chosen Ridgewood for its quiet streets and distance from his past, hoping it would offer Jaden a chance at stability. Yet the uneasy glances and muttered slurs from neighbors had quickly dispelled that illusion. Inside, Marcus sat across from Jaden at the worn wooden table, the silence between them punctuated only by the clinking of utensils. The house was sparse, furnished with second-hand pieces that spoke more of necessity than comfort. On the wall hung a single-framed photograph, a younger Marcus in uniform, standing beside his late wife, Maya. "School going okay?" Marcus finally asked. Jaden shrugged, pushing a piece of broccoli around his plate. "It's fine." Marcus leaned forward, his piercing gaze fixed on his son. "You'd tell me if it wasn't, right?" Jaden hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, of course," but Marcus wasn't convinced. He had seen the subtle signs, Jaden's reluctance to leave the house, the way he flinched at sudden noises, the bruises on his knuckles that he claimed were from gym class. Marcus wanted to press further, but he also knew pushing too hard might make his son retreat even more. Later that night, as Jaden lay asleep in his room, Marcus sat in the dimly lit living room, cleaning the disassembled parts of his old sidearm. The repetitive motion was both meditative and familiar, a ritual that steadied his nerves. Yet, even as his hands worked with a practiced precision, his mind lingered on the bikers. They called themselves the Iron Claws, a name that sent ripples of unease through the town. Marcus had overheard whispers at the grocery store about their involvement in drugs, extortion, and worse. Their leader, Roy Granger, was a towering man with a reputation for cruelty and a taste for violence. Marcus had crossed paths with Roy once already. It was their second day in town, and Jaden had accidentally bumped into one of the bikers outside the convenience store. The man had shoved Jaden to the ground, laughing as the boy scrambled to his feet. Marcus had stepped in without hesitation. "That's enough," he had said, his voice low but commanding. Roy had emerged from the crowd, towering over Marcus with a predatory grin. "You're new here, aren't you?" Marcus didn't flinch. That's right. Roy's smile widened. Then let me give you some advice. Mind your business and keep your head down. Otherwise, you and your boy might not like what happens. Marcus hadn't responded, but the warning had stayed with him. Now, as he reassembled his gun and set it aside, Marcus vowed to keep a closer watch. Ridgewood might have been their chance at a new beginning, but it was clear that trouble was already brewing. The next morning, Marcus drove Jaden to school, his knuckles white against the steering wheel. The closer they got, the quieter Jaden became. "Everything okay?" Marcus asked. "Yeah," Jaden muttered, staring out the window. Marcus followed his gaze and saw the Iron Claw's van parked near the school's entrance. Several members leaned against it, their eyes following Jaden as he stepped out of the car. Marcus forced himself to stay calm, but his instincts screamed at him to intervene. Instead, he waited until Jaden disappeared into the building before driving away. He couldn't be everywhere at once, but he could prepare. That afternoon, Marcus visited the hardware store, picking up supplies, locks, chains, and motion sensors. He also retrieved a locked case from the trunk of his car, carrying it into the house like a soldier returning with a weapon. Meanwhile, Jaden walked home alone, his backpack slung over one shoulder. He had taken the long way, hoping to avoid the bikers, but luck wasn't on his side. The Iron Claws spotted him near the park. "Hey, kid," one of them called out. Jaden froze. "Where you running off to?" Panic surged in his chest as they approached. He thought about running, but knew it would only make things worse. Instead, he stood his ground, his father's voice echoing in his head. "Stay calm. Look them in the eye." But it didn't matter. They surrounded him, their laughter ringing in his ears. When Marcus came home and found Jaden's backpack on the ground, his heart stopped. He knelt down, running his fingers over the scuffed leather and dirt-streaked fabric. He looked up and saw tire tracks leading away from the curb. Marcus's pulse quickened. He rose to his feet, his training taken over. Every nerve in his body screamed that time was running out. He grabbed his keys, his weapon, and the map of Ridgewood. This was no longer just a town. It was a battlefield. The town of Ridgewood seemed quieter than usual as Marcus Wilson gripped the steering wheel of his truck, his knuckles pale and tight. The shadows stretched long over the cracked roads, swallowing the sidewalks and empty storefronts. The faint echoes of distant motorcycles hummed in his ears like an omen, and every muscle in his body tensed as if bracing for a fight. Jaden's backpack sat on the passenger seat beside him, its strap torn and dirt-streaked. Marcus's mind replayed the image of it lying on the ground, discarded like a broken toy. It wasn't just the backpack that haunted him. It was the tire tracks, the skid marks burned into the asphalt, and the silence that followed. He had tried calling Jaden's phone 3 times. Each attempt met with the hollow ring of no answer. Now, his only focus was finding his son and bringing him home. Marcus slowed the truck as he approached the intersection near the park, scanning for any sign of movement. He remembered the Iron Claw's van parked near the school earlier that morning, the men leaning against it, their eyes sharp and predatory. A deep pit of dread coiled in his stomach. He pulled to the curb, stepping out onto the cracked pavement. The air was thick with the scent of gasoline and damp earth. He crouched near the tire tracks, studying their direction. They veered toward the outskirts of town, where old warehouses and abandoned lots sprawled like forgotten relics. His pulse quickened. He knew where they'd gone. Jaden sat hunched in the back of a dimly lit van, his wrists bound with thick rope that dug into his skin. The floor vibrated beneath him as the vehicle bounced along uneven roads. His heart pounded so loudly that it drowned out the rumble of the engine. Two bikers sat in the front seats, their voices low and rough. "You think his old man's going to come looking?" one of them asked. "Course he will," the driver replied, his voice thick with amusement. "That's the point." Jaden squeezed his eyes shut, trying to block out their words. He thought of his father, of the way Marcus had looked at him that morning before dropping him off at school. It wasn't fear in his father's eyes. It was something harder, sharper. His father wouldn't stop until he found him. Jaden clung to that thought even as the van came to a screeching halt. The doors swung open, and rough hands yanked him out into the night. The air outside smelled of rust and motor oil. Jaden stumbled as they dragged him toward a large, crumbling warehouse, its windows shattered and walls stained with graffiti. Inside, the place was even darker, lit only by the faint glow of a single overhead bulb. Chains and tools hung from the walls, and in the far corner, a battered couch sagged beneath its own weight. Roy Granger stood near the center of the room, his broad shoulders and leather vest making him look like a figure carved from stone. He grinned as Jaden was shoved to the floor at his feet. "Welcome, kid," Roy said, his voice slow and deliberate. "You're going to help send a message to your old man." Jaden looked up, his breath shallow. "He'll come for me." Roy's grin widened. "I'm counting on it." Marcus reached the edge of town, his headlights cutting through the encroaching darkness. The industrial district loomed ahead, a maze of rusted fences and abandoned buildings. He killed the engine and stepped out, his boots crunching against gravel. Years of training took over. He checked the area, noting the positions of security cameras, broken glass, and loose boards that could give away his approach. The van was there, parked outside one of the warehouses. Its rear doors hung open, and Marcus spotted a scrap of fabric caught on the hinge. Jaden's jacket. Marcus clenched his jaw. He moved quickly, but silently, pressing his back against the wall of the warehouse and peering through a gap in the boards. He could see shadows moving inside, the faint glint of metal under the harsh overhead light. Roy's voice carried through the walls. "Your daddy's a soldier, right? Bet he's taught you all sorts of tricks. But out here, none of that matters. Out here, it's about who's willing to go further." Jaden didn't answer, but Marcus could feel his son's fear like a knife in the gut. He pulled his knife from its sheath, cutting through the lock on the side door. The metal fell away with a dull thud, and Marcus slipped inside. Roy circled Jaden like a predator. "You scared yet, kid?" Jaden didn't answer. His father's voice echoed in his head. "Stay calm. Look them in the eye." Roy crouched in front of him, gripping Jaden's chin. "You should be." Suddenly, the lights cut out. "What the hell?" The sound of glass shattering broke through the darkness. A scuffle erupted near the door, followed by a grunt of pain. Marcus moved like a shadow, striking hard and fast. One biker went down with a sharp crack of bone. "Find him!" Roy shouted. The warehouse erupted into chaos. Jaden flinched as heavy footsteps thundered around him. Chains rattled and voices barked orders. Marcus darted between shadows, using the cluttered space to his advantage. He took down another biker with a blow to the knee, then grabbed the man's gun before he hit the floor. "Jaden!" Marcus's voice cut through the noise. "Dad!" Roy turned toward the sound, grabbing Jaden by the collar and hauling him up. "You think you're just gonna walk out of here?" he growled. Marcus emerged from the shadows, his weapon raised. "Let him go." Roy grinned. "Or what? You gonna shoot me in front of your kid?" Marcus's finger hovered over the trigger, but he didn't fire. Instead, he took a step closer, his voice low and steady. "You don't want to test me." Roy's grip on Jaden tightened, but Marcus saw the flicker of doubt in his eyes. In that moment, Jaden acted. He stomped down hard on Roy's foot, throwing him off balance. Marcus moved instantly, tackling Roy to the ground. The two men struggled, fists flying, but Marcus's training gave him the edge. He pinned Roy's arm behind his back, twisting until the man cried out. "Stay down," Marcus ordered. Roy spat blood but didn't move. Marcus grabbed Jaden, pulling him close. "Let's go." They didn't stop running until they reached the truck. Marcus checked Jaden for injuries, his hands trembling despite himself. "Are you okay?" Jaden nodded, tears streaming down his face. "I knew you'd come." Marcus exhaled, his arms tightening around his son. "Always." But as they drove away, Marcus glanced in the rearview mirror. He knew this wasn't over. Roy wouldn't let it end here. And Marcus wasn't done fighting. Marcus drove down the winding dirt road with Jaden curled up in the passenger seat, exhaustion pulling the boy into a fitful sleep. The rhythmic hum of the tires on gravel was the only sound inside the cab, but Marcus's thoughts raced, loud and unrelenting. He tightened his grip on the steering wheel, his knuckles white as the events of the night replayed in his head. The warehouse was behind them now, but Marcus knew the fight was far from over. Roy and his gang weren't the kind of men to let something like this slide. He could almost feel their eyes, and the dark woods that flanked the road could almost hear the growl of their engines closing in. Jaden stirred, his small body jerking as if he was still trapped in that dingy room with the chains and the taunts. Marcus reached over, resting a steadying hand on his son's shoulder. "You're safe," he said softly. Jaden opened his eyes, blinking at the dim glow of the dashboard lights. "They're going to come after us, aren't they?" Marcus didn't lie. "Maybe, but they're not getting anywhere near you again, I promise." Jaden nodded, but the fear didn't leave his eyes. Marcus hated seeing it there. The boy had already lost so much: his mother, his home, and now his sense of safety. Marcus had fought wars overseas, but nothing had prepared him for this battle, the one to keep his own son from being swallowed by fear. The truck rumbled onto the paved road leading back into Ridgewood. It was late, and the streets were deserted, but Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Every flickering streetlight, every shadow that shifted in the alleyways felt like a threat. When they reached the house, Marcus parked in the driveway and cut the engine. "Inside," he said, his voice low. "Quickly." Jaden didn't hesitate. He grabbed his backpack and darted toward the front door. Marcus followed, scanning the street before stepping inside and locking the door behind him. Once inside, Marcus moved through the house with practiced efficiency, checking the locks on the windows and doors. He paused only to grab a flashlight and his old sidearm, which now rested on the coffee table in plain sight. Jaden hovered near the stairs, his eyes fixed on the gun. "What are we going to do?" Marcus knelt in front of him, his voice calm but firm. "We're going to be ready. No matter what happens, you stay down and stay quiet. Understand?" Jaden swallowed hard and nodded. Marcus didn't sleep that night. He sat by the window, his eyes fixed on the street outside. The faint hum of a distant motorcycle sent adrenaline surging through his veins, but the sound faded without stopping. By morning, Marcus was already moving. He made Jaden breakfast, eggs and toast, but barely touched his own plate. "I need to go out for a bit," he said, sliding a knife into his boot and tucking his gun into the back of his waistband. "You stay here." Don't open the door for anyone." Jaden's eyes widened. "You're leaving?" "Just for a little while. I need to find out what we're up against." Jaden opened his mouth to protest but stopped himself. Instead, he gave a small nod. Marcus ruffled the boy's hair before stepping out into the morning light. The police station was a squat, gray building that looked as tired as the man sitting behind the desk inside. Sheriff Earl Dawson glanced up as Marcus walked in, his expression unreadable. "I was wondering when you'd show up," the sheriff said, leaning back in his chair. Marcus didn't waste time. "I need information on the Iron Claws." The sheriff raised an eyebrow. "You sure you want to go poking that hornet's nest?" Marcus's eyes hardened. "They kidnapped my son last night. I'm not poking anything. I'm putting them down." Dawson sighed and pulled a folder from the drawer. "Look, I get it. But those guys aren't just a bunch of punks. They've got connections, money, drugs, and half the town scared stiff." Marcus leaned in. "Not me." The sheriff studied him for a long moment before sliding the folder across the desk. "This is what we've got. It's not much, but it might help." Marcus flipped through the papers, his eyes scanning names, addresses, and mugshots. Roy Granger stared back at him from one of the photos, his eyes cold and calculating even in black and white. "What about their hangouts?" Marcus asked. "Besides that warehouse? There's an old gas station out near the river. They use it as a clubhouse. But if you're thinking of going in there alone..." Marcus cut him off. "I don't need advice, just information." The sheriff shook his head. "You're gonna get yourself killed." Marcus didn't respond. He took the folder and left. Back at the house, Marcus spread the papers across the kitchen table. Jaden hovered nearby, pretending to read a comic book but clearly listening. "They won't stop, will they?" Jaden finally asked. Marcus looked up. "Not unless we stop them first." Jaden hesitated before asking, "What if they come here?" Marcus's jaw tightened. "Then they'll regret it." As the day wore on, Marcus prepared. He installed motion sensors along the perimeter of the house and double-checked the locks. He cleaned his weapons and laid out supplies: a flashlight, a first aid kit, zip ties, and extra ammunition. Jaden helped where he could, but Marcus could see the tension building in him. He tried to keep the boy distracted, but it was clear that the events of the night before had left their mark. Later, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Marcus stood on the porch, scanning the darkening street. He could feel it in his bones. The Iron Claws weren't done, and neither was he. Marcus crouched at the edge of the clearing, his breath steady but shallow. The cool night air pressed in around him, thick with the scent of damp earth and pine. The rustle of leaves carried on the breeze, but his ears filtered out the natural sounds of the forest, searching for something else. Voices, footsteps, the hum of an engine. Anything that might give away their position. Hours had passed since he left Jaden at the house, locked inside with strict instructions to stay hidden and silent. It wasn't ideal. Nothing about this situation was, but Marcus had no choice. He couldn't wait for the Iron Claws to make the next move. He had to strike first. His mind replayed the sheriff's words. Old gas station by the river. It wasn't much to go on, but it was a start. Marcus had tracked men through jungles, deserts, and war zones. A gang of bikers wasn't going to outmaneuver him. But this wasn't a battlefield, not yet. Marcus moved silently through the underbrush, his boots barely disturbing the ground. The glow of headlights cut through the trees in the distance, and he froze. He dropped to one knee, pressing his body against the shadows as the vehicle passed. A battered pickup truck, its bed loaded with crates. He waited until the rumble of the engine faded, then continued forward, following the tire tracks that cut through the mud. They led to a clearing where the trees thinned, revealing the gas station. The building was a relic of another time, its faded sign hanging crookedly above shattered windows. The pumps were long gone, leaving only rusted metal husks behind. A few motorcycles were parked outside, their chrome glinting under the moonlight. Marcus counted 3 men on the perimeter, one leaning against the doorframe with a shotgun slung over his shoulder. Another sat on the hood of a car, smoking a cigarette and laughing quietly with the third. He scanned the area for weaknesses. The building itself was sturdy, but its age showed: rotting wood, broken glass, and a sagging roof. The bikers weren't professionals. They were arrogant, careless, and undisciplined. Marcus could use that. Inside the gas station, Roy Granger leaned over a table littered with maps, bottles, and scattered ammunition. His knuckles were raw, and his jaw ached from the fight with Marcus the night before. But it wasn't pain that filled his veins now. It was rage. "He humiliated us," Roy growled, slamming his fist against the table, "in front of everyone." One of the bikers shifted nervously. "Yeah, but we still got the kid for a while. Scared the hell out of him. That counts for something." Roy turned on him. "You think this is a joke? That kid is nothing. His old man is the problem." Another biker spoke up. "Word's out. Some of the guys don't like how it went down. They're saying maybe we bit off more than we can chew." Roy's eyes narrowed. Then maybe they need a reminder of who's in charge. He grabbed a crowbar from the table and strode toward the door. Marcus watched as Roy stepped outside, his silhouette sharp against the dim light spilling from the doorway. The biker leader barked orders, sending the others scrambling. 2 of them climbed onto their motorcycles, revving the engines before speeding off into the night. Marcus's lips pressed into a thin line. They were hunting him now, or worse, heading for the house. He didn't have time to wait. Slipping closer, Marcus circled around the building, staying low. He reached the back entrance, a rusted metal door hanging slightly ajar. The lock was broken. Marcus eased it open, slipping inside. The interior smelled of oil, sweat, and stale beer. Shelves that once held snacks and motor oil were now stacked with weapons and supplies. A dirty mattress lay in the corner, stained and torn. Marcus moved quickly, disabling the few cameras he found and sweeping the area for traps. He needed information, locations, plans, numbers, anything that could give him the upper hand. He rifled through papers on the table, scanning for names and addresses. Most of it was junk, receipts, phone numbers scrawled on napkins. But then he found it. A hand-drawn map with circles marking locations around Ridgewood. One of them was his house. Marcus's stomach dropped. He folded the map and tucked it into his jacket. He needed to get back before it was too late. The biker, guarding the back door, never saw him coming. Marcus struck fast, wrapping an arm around the man's neck and cutting off his air supply. The man thrashed, clawing at Marcus's arm, but it was over in seconds. Marcus lowered the body silently, retrieving the man's knife and keys before slipping out into the night. He didn't get far before the sound of an engine stopped him cold. The 2 bikers who had left earlier were back, and they weren't alone. Another truck followed behind them, its high beams cutting through the trees. Marcus cursed under his breath. He didn't have time for this. Back at the house, Jaden sat in the dark, clutching the baseball bat his father had left him. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of leaves outside sent his heart racing. He checked the locks again, just like Marcus had shown him. The motion sensors were armed, and the lights outside flickered each time something moved. But then the lights went out completely. Jaden froze. The power hadn't flickered. It had been cut. The growl of motorcycles filled the air, growing louder. Jaden darted toward the stairs, his pulse pounding. He climbed to the second floor, crouching beneath the window and peering outside. 2 bikes rolled up the driveway, their riders dismounting and spreading out. One of them carried a crowbar. Jaden's fingers tightened around the bat. Marcus saw the lights go out from the road and press the gas pedal to the floor. The truck roared as it tore through the dirt, gravel spraying behind it. He didn't slow down. The bikers in the yard turned as the truck barreled toward them, but Marcus didn't give them time to react. He swerved at the last second, clipping one of the motorcycles and sending it crashing to the ground. Jaden saw the headlights and felt the weight lift off his chest. His father was home. Marcus hit the ground running, taking down the first biker with a blow to the stomach before slamming him against the porch railing. The second one swung the crowbar, but Marcus dodged, grabbing the weapon and twisting it free. He struck hard, sending the man sprawling. Jaden burst out the door, his bat raised, but Marcus stopped him. "It's over," Marcus said, his voice steady. But even as he spoke, he knew it wasn't true. This was only the beginning. The night was thick with tension as Marcus stood in the dimly lit living room, Jaden pressed close to his side. The house smelled faintly of sweat and gun oil, the remnants of their preparation still scattered across the kitchen table. Extra ammunition, zip ties, and a small tactical flashlight that Marcus had tested twice before setting aside. Outside, the remains of the earlier skirmish lingered like ghosts. The broken motorcycle still lay in the driveway, its frame twisted and useless. Blood stained the porch where Marcus had left 2 of the bikers unconscious, bound and gagged with whatever he could find in the garage. He knew it wouldn't take long for Roy and the rest of the Iron Claws to realize what had happened. Jaden sat on the couch, gripping the baseball bat as if it were a lifeline. His eyes flickered between the windows and his father, searching for reassurance that Marcus couldn't give. "They're not done," Jaden whispered. Marcus nodded, his gaze fixed on the road beyond the window. "No, they're not." The sound of engines in the distance confirmed it. The warehouse loomed ahead as Marcus drove back into the woods, following the same path he had taken earlier. He had left Jaden in the care of Sheriff Dawson after convincing the reluctant officer that keeping the boy at the station was safer than leaving him in the house. Now, Marcus was alone again, heading straight into the heart of enemy territory. The gas station had been just a forward base. The warehouse, on the other hand, was the gang's stronghold, a sprawling structure with thick concrete walls and narrow windows that made it more fortress than hideout. The bikers had doubled their numbers since Marcus's earlier incursion. He counted at least 8 outside, including one man stationed on the roof with a scoped rifle. Floodlights mounted on poles lit up the perimeter, casting harsh beams across the gravel lot. Marcus killed the truck's engine and slid out, disappearing into the shadows along the tree line. He moved carefully, his footsteps light against the damp earth. Inside the warehouse, Roy paced the length of the room, his fingers twitching at his sides. The bikers were tense, their earlier bravado giving way to unease. Word had spread quickly about Marcus's attack at the house, and no one was laughing anymore. "He's coming," one of them said, leaning against the table. "You know that, right?" Roy's eyes snapped toward him. "I'm counting on it." He turned to the others. "Get ready. I want him alive." Marcus reached the edge of the warehouse lot and crouched behind a stack of old shipping crates. He took a moment to assess the situation. 2 guards patrolled near the entrance, their movements slow and careless. He waited until one of them wandered closer to the shadows, then struck. The man didn't even have time to draw his weapon before Marcus had him in a chokehold, lowering him silently to the ground. He pulled the guard's knife from its sheath and moved on. The second guard was smoking near the main entrance, his eyes unfocused. Marcus crept up behind him, striking hard and fast. The man crumpled, and Marcus dragged him out of sight. Inside the warehouse, Jaden's voice echoed in Marcus's memory. "They're going to come after us, aren't they?" His grip tightened on the gun as he stepped into the dimly lit hallway. The concrete walls absorbed sound, but Marcus could still hear the faint murmur of voices ahead. He moved quickly, staying close to the walls and avoiding the light. He reached the main room, peering through the doorway. Roy stood in the center, barking orders as the bikers armed themselves. Marcus didn't wait. He stepped into the room, raising his weapon. "Let's end this." The bikers spun, their eyes widening. Roy grinned. "You've got guts, soldier, I'll give you that." Marcus didn't answer. He fired. The first shot dropped one of the bikers before the others scattered, taking cover behind crates and tables. Marcus ducked as gunfire erupted, the sound deafening in the enclosed space. He moved fast, weaving between cover and taking out targets one by one. His military training took over, every motion precise and deliberate. Roy watched as his men fell, his grin fading. He grabbed a crowbar and started toward Marcus, weaving through the chaos. Marcus saw him coming. He ducked under the first swing, driving his shoulder into Roy's ribs and sending the larger man staggering back. Roy recovered quickly, swinging again. The crowbar caught Marcus's arm, and pain flared, but he didn't let it slow him down. He grabbed the weapon, twisting it free and tossing it aside. The 2 men circled each other, breathing hard. "You think this ends with me?" Roy sneered. "You think taking me down changes anything?" Marcus didn't answer. He lunged, driving his fist into Roy's jaw. The biker staggered but didn't fall. Instead, he came back swinging, catching Marcus in the side. They fought with brutal efficiency, trading blows that left both men bleeding. Marcus could feel his strength waning, but he refused to stop. Finally, he caught Roy off guard, driving him to the ground and pinning him. "This ends now," Marcus growled. Roy spat blood. "Go ahead. Finish it." Marcus stared down at him, breathing hard. Then he stood, stepping back. "You're not worth it." The remaining bikers fled as sirens echoed in the distance. Marcus tied Roy's hands behind his back and dragged him outside. The sheriff's cars pulled up moments later, their lights flashing. Dawson stepped out, taking in the scene. "Looks like you've been busy," he said. Marcus didn't smile. "Get him out of here." Later, Marcus sat on the porch with Jaden, the boy leaning against his side. The house was quiet now, the tension finally easing. "Is it over?" Jaden asked. Marcus looked out at the horizon. For now. But he knew better than to let his guard down, and so did Jaden. Marcus stood outside the warehouse, his breath coming hard and fast. Blood dripped from a shallow cut above his eyebrow, trailing down the side of his face. His knuckles throbbed from the last punch he had thrown, and the weight of exhaustion pressed against his shoulders. But he didn't let it slow him down. The cold night air felt sharp in his lungs as he scanned the area, searching for any signs of movement. The flashing lights of the sheriff's cars had faded in the distance, and the sudden quiet left a hollow echo in his ears. He had handed Roy over to the authorities, but Marcus knew better than to believe this was finished. The Iron Claws weren't just a gang, they were a pack, and a pack never let its alpha fall without a fight. Jaden waited back at the sheriff's office under Dawson's watchful eye, safe for the moment. Marcus had insisted on leaving him there, knowing that what came next wasn't something his son should see. Yet, even as he stood outside the warehouse, his thoughts kept drifting to Jaden, his voice, his fear, and the way he had clung to that baseball bat like it was his only shield. Marcus exhaled slowly, pushing those thoughts aside. He couldn't afford distraction. Not now. A faint noise caught his attention, gravel shifting. He turned sharply, raising his weapon just as a figure emerged from the shadows. "You really thought this was over?" It was Roy's voice, low and dripping with venom. Marcus froze, his eyes narrowing. It wasn't possible. He had seen the sheriff cuff him and haul him away, but as the man stepped closer, Marcus realized it wasn't Roy. It was his second in command, a wiry man with snake-like eyes and a scar that split his lip. "Roy's out," the man said, circling Marcus, "but that doesn't mean we're done." More figures emerged from the darkness. 5, maybe 6. The glint of knives and bats in their hands told Marcus exactly what they intended. He shifted his stance, lowering himself into a ready position. "You can walk away from this," he said, his voice calm but firm. "No one else has to get hurt tonight." Scarface laughed. "You think we're scared of you? You're just one man." Marcus didn't answer. He let them come. The first attacker lunged, swinging a crowbar. Marcus sidestepped, grabbing the man's wrist and twisting hard. Bones snapped, and the crowbar clattered to the ground. Marcus used it, sweeping the legs out from under the next man before driving the blunt end into his ribs. The others hesitated, their confidence faltering. Scarface snarled, "Get him!" They rushed him all at once. Marcus moved like a machine, his military training taken over. He ducked under a knife, driving his elbow into the attacker's throat. Another man grabbed him from behind, but Marcus shifted his weight, slamming the man into the wall and driving his heel into his knee. Pain flared as a bat connected with his side, but Marcus ignored it. He wrenched the bat away, using it to block the next strike before swinging it hard, knocking another biker to the ground. Blood and sweat blurred his vision, but Marcus didn't stop. He couldn't stop. One by one, they fell until only Scarface remained. The two men circled each other, their breaths heavy. "You think you're some kind of hero?" Scarface spat. "This isn't your war." Marcus tightened his grip on the bat. "You made it my war when you took my son." Scarface lunged and Marcus met him head-on. The fight was brutal. Fists and knees, sharp blows and desperate grabs. Marcus took a hit to the ribs, then another to the jaw, but he didn't let up. He drove Scarface back, forcing him to the ground. Pinning him there, Marcus raised his fist, ready to end it. But he stopped. Scarface stared up at him, his breath ragged. Marcus lowered his hand. "You're not worth it." He grabbed the man's knife, tossing it out of reach. "You tell the others, this ends here. Next time I won't hold back." Scarface didn't argue. He knew he had lost. By the time Marcus returned to the sheriff's office, dawn was breaking. Jaden ran to him the moment he stepped inside, wrapping his arms around his father. "You're okay?" Jaden whispered. Marcus hugged him tightly. "So are you." Sheriff Dawson approached, his expression guarded. "I heard what happened out there. They're calling it self-defense, but you made a hell of a mess." Marcus didn't flinch. "It's done." The sheriff studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "Let's hope so." Back at the house, Marcus sat on the porch with Jaden, watching the sunrise. The boy leaned against his father's side, his eyes half closed but still alert. "Are we safe now?" Jaden asked. Marcus looked out at the empty street. "For now," he said. Jaden was quiet for a moment. Then he sat up straighter. "Can you teach me?" Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Teach you what?" Jaden gripped the baseball bat, his knuckles white. "How to fight, how to protect myself." Marcus felt a pang in his chest. He wanted to shield Jaden from all of it, the violence, the fear, the darkness, but he also knew that wasn't possible. Not anymore. "Yeah," Marcus said finally, "I can teach you." And as the sun climbed higher, pushing back the shadows, Marcus allowed himself to believe, just for a moment, that they could rebuild, that they could move forward. But deep down, he knew this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. The sun hung low over Ridgewood, casting long, golden beams across the battered porch where Marcus sat. The echoes of the past day's chaos still lingered in the air like smoke after a fire. The wooden boards creaked under his weight as he leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. His hands, scarred and bruised, clasped the mug of black coffee that had long since gone cold. Inside the house, Jaden's footsteps padded softly across the floor. Marcus heard him shuffle papers at the kitchen table, no doubt organizing the notes and drawings he had been using to plan out his training sessions. Training. It had started 2 days ago, just hours after Marcus brought Jaden home from the sheriff's office. The boy had asked to learn how to defend himself, and Marcus hadn't hesitated. Teaching Jaden to fight had felt like giving him armor, something to hold on to in a world that had proven itself dangerous. But it wasn't just about the techniques, blocking, striking, and footwork. It was about discipline, focus, and control. Marcus needed Jaden to know that strength wasn't just about how hard you could hit, but how much you could endure. The first day had been the hardest. Jaden had struggled to keep up, frustration building with every failed attempt, but Marcus had been patient, pushing the boy just enough to make him try harder without breaking him. By the third session, Marcus had seen something shift. Jaden's movements became sharper, his focus clearer. The fear that had clouded his eyes was still there, but it no longer controlled him. Marcus took another sip of his coffee, his eyes drifting to the street. Ridgewood seemed quieter than usual. After the raid at the warehouse, word had spread quickly. The Iron Claws had scattered, their leadership shattered. Some had been arrested, while others had fled town. But Marcus knew better than to believe it was truly over. Sheriff Dawson had made that clear when he stopped by earlier that morning. "They're in disarray right now," Dawson had said, leaning against his patrol car. "But men like that don't just disappear. Sooner or later, some of them will come back. Maybe not Roy, but someone else." Marcus had nodded. He didn't need the warning. He already knew. Jaden stepped out onto the porch, his face flushed and his hair damp with sweat. He carried a practice stick, just a length of wood Marcus had cut from an old broom handle, and twirled it nervously in his hands. "I'm ready for the next drill," Jaden said. Marcus raised an eyebrow. "You sure? You've been at it all morning." Jaden nodded. "I don't want to stop." Marcus stood, setting the mug aside. "All right, let's see what you've got." They moved to the patch of dirt near the driveway where Marcus had drawn rough training circles with chalk. Jaden stepped into position, holding the stick like a sword. "Remember," Marcus said, circling him, "balance. Keep your weight centered." Jaden adjusted his stance. Marcus lunged suddenly, and Jaden flinched, barely managing to block the strike. "Don't back away. Hold your ground." Jaden tightened his grip, his eyes narrowing. Marcus saw the determination in his face, the same look he had seen so many times in the eyes of his fellow soldiers. They moved in quick bursts, trading blows and counters. Marcus pressed harder, testing Jaden's reflexes. The boy stumbled once, then twice, but each time he recovered faster. After several minutes, Marcus stepped back, nodding. "Good. Better than yesterday." Jaden grinned, but it quickly faded as he glanced toward the road. "What if they come back?" "They will," Marcus said, his voice steady. "Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but they will." Jaden's hands tightened around the stick. "And we'll be ready." Marcus rested a hand on his son's shoulder. "Damn right we will." That night, Marcus sat at the kitchen table, cleaning his weapons. Jaden had gone to bed hours earlier, but Marcus couldn't sleep. His thoughts drifted to the map he had taken from the warehouse, the one that marked Ridgewood with red circles. He had studied it carefully, memorizing the locations the gang had targeted. One of those marks had been their home. Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just about territory. The Iron Claws hadn't been after random power. They had been after fear. He wondered how much of that fear still lingered in Ridgewood. The next morning, Marcus drove Jaden to school. It was the first time the boy had gone back since the kidnapping, and Marcus could feel his unease. "You don't have to do this today," Marcus said as they pulled into the parking lot. Jaden shook his head. "I want to." Marcus studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Okay, but you call me the second something feels off." Jaden smiled faintly. "I will." Marcus watched him walk into the building, his shoulders squared and his head high. By midday, Marcus was back at the sheriff's office, going over the case files Dawson had pulled for him. Most of the bikers who had been arrested had refused to talk, but a few had given up enough information to confirm what Marcus already suspected. The Iron Claws weren't just a local gang. They were connected to a larger network that stretched beyond Ridgewood. Roy had been a small piece of a much bigger puzzle. "That means this isn't over," Dawson said, closing the file. Marcus nodded. "It never is." Later that evening, Marcus and Jaden sat on the porch again, watching the sunset. The shadows stretched long across the yard, but this time they didn't feel as threatening. Jaden rested the practice stick against the railing. "What if they do come back?" Marcus leaned back, his gaze steady. "Then we'll face them, together." Jaden looked at his father, the fear in his eyes slowly being replaced by something else. Confidence. And as night fell, Marcus allowed himself to believe that, for the first time in a long while, they might just be okay. But deep down, he knew the fight wasn't over. It never was. The morning sun crept over Ridgewood, painting the rooftops in muted gold and warming the dew-soaked grass that stretched out before Marcus's porch. He stood in the doorway, one hand resting against the frame, as he watched Jaden practicing in the yard. The boy moved with purpose now, his feet planted firmly as he swung the wooden training stick Marcus had carved for him. Each strike was sharper, more deliberate than the last. Sweat glistened on his brow, but he didn't stop to wipe it away. Marcus felt a swell of pride mixed with something heavier. There was no denying the boy's progress. Jaden had come a long way in just a few weeks, but Marcus couldn't ignore what it meant. He was training his son to fight. Not for sport or discipline, but to survive. It was a weight Marcus carried in silence. He wanted to believe that the worst was behind them, that the Iron Claws were broken and scattered, but the truth gnawed at him every time he closed his eyes. He had seen men like Roy Granger before, predators who thrived on power and fear, and predators didn't stay down for long. Later that day, Marcus drove into town to meet with Sheriff Dawson. The station felt emptier than usual, the kind of quiet that set Marcus's nerves on edge. Dawson leaned back in his chair, tipping his hat up as Marcus stepped inside. "I was wondering when you'd come by," the sheriff said. Marcus pulled out the map he had taken from the gang's hideout and dropped it on Dawson's desk. "Tell me you've made progress." Dawson picked up the map, his brow furrowing as he traced the red circles marking different locations around town. "We've been keeping tabs on the ones we arrested," Dawson said, "but a few slipped through the cracks. No sign of Roy either. Word is someone helped him to skip town before we could lock him down tight." Marcus clenched his jaw. He had expected as much. Men like Roy always had a backup plan. "What about the others?" Marcus asked. Dawson sighed. "Some of them are still out there, laying low for now, but that won't last." Marcus studied the sheriff. "You're not ready for this." Dawson didn't argue. "Probably not. That's why I was hoping you'd stick around." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "We can use someone like you," Dawson continued, "not as a deputy, nothing official, but as a consultant, someone the department can call when things get out of hand." Marcus leaned back, letting the idea sink in. He had spent his entire life as a soldier, trained to act in the face of danger. Walking away from that wasn't something he knew how to do. "Think about it," Dawson said. Marcus didn't answer. He just nodded and walked out. Back at home, Jaden waited on the porch, the training stick resting across his lap. "How did it go?" he asked. Marcus sat down beside him, stretching his legs out and letting out a long breath. "Same as before. They're not gone. Not really." Jaden gripped the stick tighter. "Then what do we do?" "We stay ready," Marcus said, "but we don't let fear control us." Jaden looked up at him, his expression steady. "You're not scared, are you?" Marcus hesitated. "Not for myself." Jaden didn't say anything, but Marcus could see the determination in his eyes, the same fire that had pushed him through training, even when he wanted to quit. The weeks passed, and Ridgewood began to feel normal again, or as normal as it could be after what had happened. Jaden returned to school, and though the stares and whispers hadn't completely stopped, they no longer seemed to bother him. He held his head high, his confidence growing with each passing day. Marcus took on the role Dawson had suggested, unofficially at first. He helped train the local deputies, teaching them tactics and strategies that only someone with his experience could offer. But he also kept an eye on the shadows. He watched the roads leading in and out of town, memorized the faces of strangers passing through, and stayed ready for the moment when the peace would inevitably break. One evening, as Marcus cleaned his rifle on the porch, Jaden joined him with a notebook in hand. "What's that?" Marcus asked, setting the rifle aside. Jaden flipped it open, revealing sketches and diagrams of different traps and defenses. "I've been thinking," Jaden said. "If they come back, we should be ready, not just with training, but with plans." Marcus smiled, flipping through the pages. "You've got a good head for this." Jaden shrugged. "I learned from the best." Marcus reached out, ruffling the boy's hair. "We'll make sure they never catch us off guard again." But even as the days stretched on, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. It started with small things. Rumors at the hardware store about unfamiliar bikers passing through town, footprints near the edge of their property that didn't match any of their boots. And then, late one night, Marcus's phone rang. He answered quickly, his voice sharp. "Wilson." "It's Dawson," the sheriff said. "We've got trouble." Marcus felt his muscles tense. What kind of trouble? One of my deputies spotted a group of bikers near the old highway, Dawson said. They weren't wearing the Iron Claws patches, but it's them. I'd bet my badge on it. Marcus stood, already reaching for his gun. Where? By the time Marcus reached the edge of town, the bikers were gone, but the message was clear. This wasn't over. Jaden stood on the porch when Marcus returned, his eyes searching his father's face for answers. They're back, Marcus said. Jaden didn't flinch. He just nodded. Then we're ready. Marcus looked at his son, seeing not just the boy he had sworn to protect, but the man he was becoming. And, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Marcus knew they would face whatever came next together, because some battles never truly ended. And this one was just getting started. Thanks for watching. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new stories. Share this video with your friends and watch our other stories. There are more exciting stories to come.